Tonight's presentation is being made possible with support from the UI and their Lighting Up the Arts program. Good evening. My name's Kimberly Carew, and I'm an educator with the New Haven Museum. And I welcome you all to our presentation tonight, Bob Steele on the Radio, the Life of Connecticut's Beloved Broadcaster, with author Paul Hensler. Paul received a master's degree in history from Trinity College in Hartford, and he served as a tour guide at the Connecticut State Capitol. While working in Hartford, he became a faithful listener of Bob Steele's radio program through the 1980s and the early 1990s. Hensler's interest in Bob Steele grew from the realization that there was no biography of the much-loved radio host. His hope is that by presenting Steele's story in full, the broadcasting legend will be rightfully remembered and gain membership into the Connecticut Hall of Fame. I present to you Paul Hensler.
Okay, thank you so much. This is the book that I wrote with Bob Steele, obviously very much in mind, and what we're going to do is go through the life of the man and hopefully bring out a couple of facets of his life that people didn't know or might not necessarily associate with him. Of course, that wonderful rich voice that he lent to WTIC AM radio for decades, literally, that landed him in the National Radio Hall of Fame. We'll learn about that also, but primarily, as we start right from the very beginning here, the idea behind the book relates to a birthday anniversary wish that I saw posted on the Facebook group Old Hartford in late July of 2017. And the posting specifically came a little bit late, and the gentleman who put the posting up at the end of the month said, sorry, I'm a couple weeks late. I usually do it actually on Bob Steele's birthday anniversary. But then I generally don't contribute much to these particular discussions, but something just kind of sticks in my craw. And I posted a comment expressing my disappointment over the omission of Steele's naming to the Connecticut Hall of Fame. We'll learn a little bit more about the National Radio Hall of Fame, but there is such a thing as the Connecticut Hall of Fame. If you travel to the Legislative Office building in Hartford, you'll see on the second floor, there's a very nice wood-paneled wall with the names of very famous dignitaries, famous people, writers, politicians, basketball coaches, if you will, also, who've contributed greatly to the history of our state. However, it just struck me always as very odd that here we have Bob Steele, who spent so many years at WTIC, member of the National Radio Hall of Fame, that has no name of his own on the Connecticut Hall of Fame with those other famous names up there. And also, I realized that back sometime in the early 2000s, because I remember Phil Steele came and spoke to many public libraries, including the public library in Ellington, which is the town that I was living in at the time. And he produced what you see there on our little living room table, the 10-volume set called Bob Steele Century. It's encyclopedic in nature. Each of those books that you see there is about 200 pages. And what Phil did was curate thousands and thousands of photographs of mementos that Steele left. He curated diary entries and basically told the story of his father through all these photographs and all these particular artifacts. It's really quite astounding. And it goes basically from birth to death of Bob Steele. However, it also occurred to me at this time that there's no single volume biography of Bob Steele. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if we had just one book that you could pick up and read about his whole life without having to go through so much material? Now, obviously, the volumes that you see there are very accessible. They're also available for free if you go to the right public library. I know the Hartford Public Library has these. And when Phil created this particular set, he did so with the idea that they would go, for the most part, to public libraries where anybody could have access to them rather than spending $350 for the entire set. But nonetheless, when I realized that a smaller version that told the whole man's life all in one single volume, I began work on it in roughly early September of 2017. and I finished in January of 2019. And the book was published in August of 2019. I gave quite a few personal appearances up until COVID really set in and put everything back. So thankfully, some folks like the wonderful people at the New Haven Museum have given me the opportunity to bring this back out into the public eye. The early life of Bob Steele. Robert Jesse Steele was born in Kansas City, July 13th, 1911. And I've underlined his middle name there because many of you are recalling, oh, Robert L. Steele, Robert Lee Steele. However, his birth name, his middle birth name was Jesse, but he changed it when he was exposed to a local neighborhood boy who was a bully, and he also named Jesse. He did not want to have that association, so he changed his middle name shortly thereafter. His parents divorced when Steele was just a young boy. His father was an agricultural products salesman and traveled a lot throughout the Midwest, was not home that often. He was the only son of Susan and Hampton Steele. And as a young boy, Bob Steele built a crystal radio set, something kind of a novelty back then. But when we realized that Bob Steele was born in 1911, commercial radio is really only in its infancy. We don't really get into commercial radio until when Bob Steele is a young boy. So we find that the life of Bob Steele basically is sort of on a very close parallel track with the radio industry. So he builds this crystal radio set. He liked to pretend that he was voicing material as if he were actually broadcasting on the radio. And at the same time, with his parents now divorced, Steele is living with his mother. He goes to school and works to support his mother. His mother also works some small jobs as well, but Bob Steele would ping pong back and forth between his education and working to support himself and his mother. And he liked to joke about this a lot in later age, but by the time he was 18 years old, he did achieve his high school graduation diploma. And he was very proud to say Bob Steele HSG, which stood for high school graduate. And back then, this really still was a big deal because a lot of basic education just went through the 8th grade. He finally completed his high school degree and was really quite proud of it, but that was not the end of his learning process, as we'll get into a little bit later. At a young age, he develops a love for motorcycles and automobiles, and especially motorcycles. He became a hill climber, a racer. He became expert in all facets of the motorcycle itself. He actually, at the age of 15, I believe, he had a column with Motorcycling Magazine. This was a novelty in a way that somebody so young could write as well as he did. But again, it just shows his love for motorcycles, to say nothing of his love for money, because he began writing this column for the magazine and realized that I could do writing and get paid for this. So there's a little bit of a financial incentive behind this as well. And of course, he becomes an amateur boxer. He did have some professional fights, if you will. He had a very checkered record, but again, he always had a love of boxing. Somebody was asking me a couple of days ago about what his favorite sport was, and I kind of defaulted to saying baseball, but boxing also had to be right up there as well because he was an active participant and also a very skilled ring announcer as well. As you can imagine, with the Great Depression setting in October of 1929, economic conditions didn't rapidly spread to the Midwest until a couple months later, but finally by December of 1930, conditions of the Depression were such that it was time to move along. They followed the Great Migration to California. So Steele goes and does a little bit of advance work in December of 1930, and shortly thereafter, his mother, Susan, followed him in March of 1931. And what's Steele doing once he gets out there? He works for the Indian Motorcycle Shop in Los Angeles. He works as a motorcycle courier for a bank. He worked as a motorcycle stuntman and also a salesman. And playing to his sense of humor and his love of puns and sort of a disjointed language, colloquial language, if you will, the name of his column for Motorcycle Magazine was Crocker Throttle Cracks. And this was something that he also did illustrations for himself. And it just really plays to the wonderful sense of humor that he always exhibited in the writing columns, that particular style of humor that he loved in everyday life. He seemed to find humor in just about every facet of everyday life. Among his vocations, again, he is a motorcycle racer. Hill climbing on motorcycles was also a sport at that time. again, a boxer. Back in Kansas City, he and his mother opened a sandwich shop. It became a financial failure, unfortunately, but they were trying to do something just to have some sort of an income to support themselves. By the time Steele gets out to California, he's working as a timekeeper on a farm, again, a journalist for Motorcycling Magazine. And the little sample page that you see off to the side here, that's a page from Motorcycling Magazine. That's a particular column that he happened to write in one of those issues. And you'll notice the little cartoons that also accompany that. He was a very skilled cartoonist. His doodling was really top notch, but he also had a flair for very comic drawing. And we'll see a little bit of this in a couple slides. But again, he was very proud to be able to provide these illustrations for the articles that he wrote for Motorcycling Magazine. I put a gold star next to this particular final entry here because, as you can imagine, somebody who spent a lot of time on a motorcycle doing racing and stunt work and such was bound to end up getting hurt once in a while. And there are actually some instances that he probably could have lost his life. He was injured one day. He went to a racing track. He was injured, so he's not able to participate. But the racetrack announcer for that particular day did not show up. So they need a fill-in emergency replacement for the announcer. Steele gets behind the microphone, and because of his vast knowledge in all aspects of motorcycle racing, he knew the racers themselves. He also knew all the particulars about the mechanics of the bike. He won instant favor with the crowd and just really went over extremely, extremely well. So here we have the real beginning of his career as an announcer. So I put a gold star next to that because it's really one of the important springboards of him getting into announcing. In 1936, motorcycle promoter George Lanham is looking to expand motorcycle racing because it's a popular spectator sport during the Great Depression. And Lanham is looking for somebody to do announcing for him. And of course, he goes right to Bob Steele because he's so skilled and very popular. So Bob Steele finds his way east. He came to Hartford, Connecticut. He was dropped off near Union Station in downtown Hartford the early morning of May 10th, 1936. And he worked that season's racing schedule not only in Hartford, but also Albany, New York. So he was very busy doing both venues. By the time the season ended at Bulkley Stadium in Hartford, of course, which no longer exists, but I think the original venue for that was somewhere on Franklin Avenue. I know that there's an historical marker someplace there, but I'm not sure exactly where, but nonetheless, that was where the motorcycle races would take place. At the end of September, with the racing season done, he has to go back to California because with no more announcing jobs, he has to pick up employment someplace. So he's ready to go back to California. He's waiting for his ride in downtown Hartford. He's basically on Central Row, right across the street from the old State House. He was going to go into a movie to kill time until his ride showed up. The woman at the box office said, you might not want to go inside right away, go see the very end of the movie because it's going to, she was giving him a spoiler alert. So he had a couple extra minutes to kill. He supposedly wandered into the studios over at WTIC, which were located within the confines of the Travelers Insurance Company building on Grove Street. He stumbled into an audition because they were auditioning for staff announcers that particular day. There were 12 men who had shown up, and Steele walked in, basically said, look, do you have any announcing jobs? And Paul Morency said, well, I've already auditioned 12 guys. What's one more? Come on in if you want an audition. He was on the air the very next day, October 1st, 1936, thus beginning what became a 66-year career working on WTIC AM 1080. In the course of doing the research for the book, I found a real gem of an artifact at the Hartford History Center. I found the actual employment application that he filled out for WTIC. And again, he began his career October 1st of 1936, but I couldn't help but notice at the very top of the job application is the quote that you see there. It must be understood by the applicant that the approval of an application does not carry with it the promise of a permanent position with this company. Quite ironic that here he filled out the application and he was on the air the very next day. In a full-time capacity for many of those years, is he somewhat retired, if we think of it in those terms. He was quite an elderly gentleman. He did fill in on occasion, but nonetheless, he was on the air at some point, whether full-time or part-time, for the next 66 years. And he came up with the moniker, giving the official station identification of WTIC Hartford, Connecticut, USA. Very important to note that in the early days of radio, and especially in the 1930s, there was a phenomenon known as skywave propagation. Now, there's no television signals at that time, but very powerful radio stations, given the right atmospheric conditions, could have their signal carried almost literally around the world. And I never saw it myself, but supposedly there was a map at WTIC that indicated through different colored pin placements all around the globe of where the signal could be picked up. And I guess on rare occasions, WTIC could be heard as far away as Australia. So by adding that USA as a delimiter of sorts when he gave the station ID, this was a way to indicate exactly where the broadcast was originating from. This I call the most important person Bob Steele ever met. And her name was Astrid Shirley Hansen of West Hartford, the daughter of Swedish immigrants. She was a secretary at WTIC, worked in the Grove Street building on a different floor from where the radio station was. And Bob Steele shared an elevator ride with her one day, and he was absolutely smitten by her. Had to find out who she was, had to ask her out for a date. And she is very anxious to date this gentleman also, because she always found this wonderful car parked out on Grove Street, out on the street just outside the building. Now, we're still in the throes of the Depression, 1936, 1937, and she thought that this particular automobile belonged to him. So when he asked her out for a date, she was very much excited to be able to take advantage of the opportunity. So you can imagine there was quite a bit of disappointment on her part when, instead of showing up in the fancy automobile, Bob Steele shows up for her first date by walking on foot to her door. But nonetheless, they overcame that little bit of a glitch, and they hit it off right away. In the fall of 1937, they were engaged, and they were married shortly thereafter. And I include also a photograph of a letter, very typical of what Bob Steele would send to her. This is how smitten he was. She lived on Beverly Road in West Hartford, Connecticut. And as you can see, he didn't just simply address the envelope and send it to her. His very whimsical artwork is ever present on all this correspondence. We can see all the different colors that he uses and how whimsical, cartoony the fonts are. He has a little caricature of himself in the return address. You'll notice that he has his striped shirt and tie with the pencil in his ear. And if you can look closely, a little bit difficult, I know, with a particular slide here, he actually spent a whopping 10 cents for a special delivery stamp. So this was very, very important to make sure that she got that. So he spared no expense to make sure that he paid to get special delivery on all this correspondence. And this is just one of many love letters and cards that he would send to her for any and every occasion. And of course, they were married, and they had 4 sons from 1938 and in the ensuing 9 years. And all this time, his radio career is also blossoming. He became a co-host on the G Fox Morning Watch, and he also came up with the idea for having a program devoted entirely to sports programming, to give a recap of scores at the end of the day. It was called Strictly Sports, and this was really a novelty back in the 1930s. He came up with this idea in 1938, and it gave the opportunity to have everybody get caught up, especially when we had a lot of afternoon baseball games back then. Night baseball was really just starting very, very slowly to come into its own. So Steele wanted to have a means to be able to get baseball scores out to the general public for those who were very interested in it. So he formulated the Strictly Sports show. The Morning Watch over time segued into something became very popularly known, and I'm sure many of us recall the Bob Steele show. The hours of the show varied. It went from either 6 to 8 or 6 to 7:30, 6 to 9, 5:30 to 10, depending upon what year you happen to be tuning into Bob Steele. In my later experience with Bob Steele in the 1980s and into the 1990s, he came on at 5:30 and his show lasted until 10 o'clock, as my recollection was. When Bob and Shirley are first married, incidentally, she went by her middle name more colloquially than her Swedish first name. Shirley was her preferred name. The couple moved from Hartford to Wethersfield in June 1941, and again, the family expanded over the ensuing years. So in the photograph that we see there going from left to right, we have Phil Steele with the open collared shirt, Robert with the dark colored sport jacket in the background. Shirley, we can see in the foreground seated with young Stephen, looks only like he's a toddler at that point. And then Paul Steele, the second son of Bob and Shirley that you see on the right-hand side there. And of course, over many, many years, the famous features that became associated with his program. Probably most famously was his word for the day. This was his way to spread the knowledge and love of language that he just exhibited on every single show. The word for the day was very important because he wanted to give people the encouragement to learn the English language the same way that he did himself. Get your nose into a dictionary if you don't understand the meaning of a particular word, and pronouncing words as they should be. I remember his two of them specifically, that it was athlete, not athlete, just the same as it was supposed to be sophomore, not sophomore. He is very particular on pronunciations like this. And in the, I believe, based on the subtitle of the book, there are 65 years of wit and wisdom, that the word for the day book that we see there probably came out in 2001. Again, many words associated with what he was trying to put across for educating the public at large through the vehicle of his radio program. He had a little feature called Tiddlywinks, and he would pull these little items off of the teletype, and they dealt with celebrities or quirky circumstances that happened around the world, if not only just the United States. And he would edit those to fit his style and make sure that the language was absolutely correctly stated. This was something that was a little fun feature that he included with his program in the later hours of his show. Before we came on for our presentation today, Kim and I were talking about something that Bob Steele was very famous for in the 1950s and through the 1960s, until it was handed off finally to a staff announcer. But many people recall Bob Steele making the no school announcements because of inclement weather, especially in the wintertime, that this is something that a lot of people remember him doing. He made special significance for 80th birthdays. If you turned 80 years old, you could submit, or a family member could submit your name to him, and it would be read on the air as a special birthday, having achieved 80 years of age. Sports personalities, he loved sports of every stripe, and again, especially boxing and baseball, but he also had the opportunity to interview many other famous sports personalities. He would use these interviews in the early days of his Strictly Sports program. Baseball teams that travel from Boston to New York frequently would have the opportunity to stop off in Hartford to be able to play an exhibition game against a local amateur team or semi-professional team. Money would be charged for admission, of course, and the professional teams actually got a portion of the gate, so they were very happy to do that because there weren't multi-million-dollar players back then. So this was an extra way to get some quick cash as you're traveling from one city to another. So by stopping in Hartford, Bob Steele had the opportunity to also interview players like Dizzy Dean or Leo DeRocher. He would be able to put those interviews on his sports program that same evening. And of course, he was also famous for his time checks and the antenna switches. Very persnickety with running the show, that once you got to the top of the hour, that was when he gave the station ID, and then he segued immediately to the top of the hour news broadcast. The sports came on at 7:15. The weather came on at 25 after, and everything had to be run exactly on time. We also have the 100% wrong club, as he jokingly referred to it. He was notorious for always making wrong predictions on a famous sporting event. For example, the Kentucky Derby, or a big football game like the Super Bowl or perhaps maybe the Rose Bowl on New Year's Day. He was always notorious because he seemed to always pick the team that would end up losing. But in fact, he was always a champion of the underdog. So if you root for the underdog, you're probably going to lose more often than win. But nonetheless, this was his way to cater to supporting the underdog. I include one picture there again in the bottom, just to the right of center. That's Willie Pep, born in Middletown, Connecticut, and the adopted son of the city of Hartford, a famous boxer who became very good friends with Bob Steele. So this is one example of Steele's continuing love of the sport of boxing. Steele achieves lasting recognition in a number of ways. In the early 1980s, he actually achieved the top market share in the United States for radio broadcasts in the early 1980s. And this is quite an astounding feat when you consider that here we are in Hartford, nestled in between the city of Boston, which has a major radio market, and of course to the southwest of us here, we also have the city of New York. So this is really quite an astounding achievement that a relatively humble man at a radio station in Hartford, Connecticut, comes up with the top market share in the entire country. And this helps propel him to fame in being able to facilitate his induction into the National Radio Hall of Fame in 1995. The old Grove Street in Hartford was also renamed Bob Steele Street. This came after his passing. This was in the early 2000s. I believe this finally took place in 2006, if I have the date right. And again, I just draw attention to this, that here we have many noted personalities who have been inducted into the Connecticut Hall of Fame, but for some reason we don't have Bob Steele there, at least not yet. The pictures across the bottom, the one in the center there where he's in black tie, this was really a very significant gala. And the broadcast was done, as you can see, I think this was intended to be West Farms Mall. I know they did some special events at West Farms Mall, but as I'm looking at the picture, it almost looks like it's the courtyard of the Hartford Civic Center. But nevertheless, the date at the bottom is quite significant, July 13th, 1991. And this was the opportunity when it came to give the 80th birthday list. He finally got to announce his own name because that was the day that he turned 80 years old. And of course, he's acknowledging the crowd there very proudly. I named one chapter in the book I took the title of it from a quote from a magazine article that featured him. His title was "The Sleepless but Amusing Life of a Radio Announcer." And it's very compelling that all the different things that these little quirks of circumstances, all the ticks and foibles that the man had throughout his life that we either knew something about, or what I'm trying to draw in my book is to bring these things to light, to give a little bit more of an in-depth look at Bob Steele. The diaries that he accumulated over the years, again, those are available at the Hartford History Center at the Hartford Public Library. If you have the opportunity to browse through those, you really get a different idea of what the man was like, and you understand what life was like on his home front. Here he was so busy with his radio work when he was doing the morning show and the evening show for Strictly Sports. He really is working two shifts, if you think about it. He's working those two shifts at the radio station. As his popularity grew, you can imagine he was also requested as an after-dinner speaker or a lunchtime speaker for civic organizations. So he was constantly on the go. When we look at his diary, you can see where he may have gone off to Boston or New York for a baseball game, or gone someplace to partake or witness a boxing match. So he just seems to be a man in perpetual motion. He also enjoyed his card games. It was not unusual, not frequently, but it was not unusual on occasion that he would be engaged in an all-night poker game, get home perhaps at 2 o'clock in the morning, get just a few quick hours of sleep, and then back in the studio again, up at 4:30 in the morning to get into the studio to get prepared for his coming on the air at 5:30 or 6 o'clock. So he just seemed to be a man constantly in motion. I include this little quote of a nickname here, Mama. When you look at the diary entries, Shirley's name segues to Mama. Mama's fixing something in the kitchen. No wonder I can't lose any weight, because Mama's cooking something wonderful again. And she really was an extraordinary cook. Their oldest son, Robert, indicated that her Swedish pancakes were really second to none. It was really a treat that the whole family enjoyed. Also looking at the diaries, we see what a figure filbert that Steele was. He kept track of all kinds of expenses in these diaries, playing to the age, of course, the cost relative to the time, but he'll write things in such as, I purchased a new lawnmower and it cost me $110.38. He loved his automobiles. He would put how much the particular automobile cost right down to the penny. So he didn't have any particular indication of using a computer. I think he would have enjoyed using spreadsheets for keeping track of such expenses, but he was the pen and paper guy, and we see all these different entries throughout the diaries that they have at the History Center. A wordsmith, of course, always had a love of dictionaries, and he paid attention to them too, because he would learn how to pronounce the foreign names of cities, or foreign names of, say, music composers, that sort of thing. This is very important to him, to be able to not only understand the meanings of words, but also the proper pronunciation, even in different languages. His integrity was foremost. He makes a diary entry indicating that he had forgotten an interest payment that wasn't included, or a certificate of deposit, some money that wasn't included with his income tax return, and he's kicking himself because the income tax return had to be refiled with the proper amount in it. But he shrugs his shoulders, and he actually writes this in his entry, saying that, I have to do things the right way. His charitable work, especially with the American Red Cross, was non-pareil. I believe he was a member of the 10-gallon club for donating blood. This was extremely crucial during the war effort of World War II, that he was able to use his radio program and his popularity as a vehicle to get people to donate blood. And he let his actions speak for him, that he was not afraid to roll up his sleeve to help that effort, certainly. I include a couple things also in later chapters of the book to give an idea of the work that he did in the studio. One of his engineers was very kind to give me sort of a play-by-play, if you will, of what was going on in the studio and putting things together relative to the time again. But music cartridges and advertisements would be put on cartridges that were played. These are tapes, of course, obviously, but preparation for things like that. Steele coming in early in the morning and looking at different newspapers to see little items that he would be able to read to his audience once he went on the air. So all these little facets that went into the production of a radio show, and he's doing this six times a week, 6 days a week, to make his show so successful. And also we have the human side of the man. We're very familiar with all the joviality and his good-naturedness, his love of puns and cornball humor. But behind the scenes, when things didn't go right, he could have a volcanic temper. He would be handed a script written by a continuity writer, and if a word was misspelled or the wrong word, wrong synonym was used, we could find that he could just be absolutely explosive once he went off the air, because the script was not typed the way that it should have been and would cause confusion. He's trying to read something on the air. It has no opportunity to practice it. He has to read it perfectly right then and there. So when things didn't go right, he would let those people know in no uncertain terms. And his legacy, of course, the popularity that he gained for so many years working on WTIC, the people that he met, going to the grocery store, even running chores, running errands in the course of everyday life could be a challenge, because so many people wanted to stop to talk to him or share a joke with him that he could use on the air. So this is all part of his legacy too, that here's a man who spent so many years on the radio at WTIC, and again, that lasting fame just ingrained itself so much in the everyday life of so many people. In my case, I admit to this as well, especially in the 1980s, that he became a part of my morning routine every single day, basically through the end of his radio career. Also in my book, I include what I call a couple of historical detours. Again, the development of radio as a new medium comes along pretty much at the same time that Bob Steele is born. So they have a pretty much parallel track as far as growing up together, if you will. And when Bob Steele comes on the air in 1936, the age of radio was really only about a generation old to that point. And I cover the ground of how WTIC radio came to be. Motorcycle racing is a spectator sport. I covered a little bit of ground with that also, because we had people who would engage in cross-country motorcycle races. They were literally race from the East Coast to the West Coast. There was a husband-wife team who engaged in this type of motorcycle rally racing. So motorcycle racing as a sport became more salient to me as I was researching this particular book. The creation of television, I also cover some of the ground here, because WTIC Channel 3 came on the air in 1957. This had growing pains of its own, because they had their television studio also incorporated with the radio facility on Grove Street in the Travelers Building. And that created its own set of complications, because you not only had a radio studio, but you had to have more floor space for television. And by the very early 1960s, we have the creation and the building of Constitution Plaza diagonally across the street from where the Grove Street building was. And this is important because we have urban renewal taking place in the post-World War II boom of the 1950s. Hartford was among many cities in Connecticut that were undergoing such development. When Constitution Plaza was built, Broadcast House, where WTIC radio and television moved, they were only there for basically 13 years. But nonetheless, this was something that plays into the development of modern Hartford, modern downtown Hartford. So if you go through the narrative of my book, you'll see what I call these historical detours to explain some of the things and set these events and what's going on in Bob Steele's life, set these details in context. And finally, as Bob Steele would wrap up some of his shows on occasion, he would say, pip, pip, cheerio, auf Wiedersehen, adios, and all that stuff. And with that, I also conclude my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. And we'll switch over now, Kim, to the chat.
Paul, I had a few people ask if they could have your email address. Would you prefer that they go to paulhensler.com to contact you?
Yes, there's a contact feature on my website, and as you can see down here at the bottom of the screen, www.paulhensler.com. There's a contact feature on the top of that home screen, and they can reach me through that.
All right, I see we do have a couple of questions. The first one that came in is someone like to know about the transition from Ben Hawthorne and Bob Steele in the 1940s. They understood that it was not a smooth switchover. And do you know anything about that?
Yes. If you'll excuse me, I'm just looking very quickly through the book because I do touch on the narrative. And I believe what had happened was Hawthorne went someplace else. His wife, whose name was Chavila, took over for him. And I believe she was not as popular, obviously, as her husband. And Steele helped to fill that void. I'm just trying to look this up very, very quickly to get a better answer for the question. Yeah, Hawthorne enlisted in 1942. Ben Hawthorne enlisted in the Army, and his broadcasting duties were taken over temporarily by his wife. At a time when jobs in many fields previously filled by men were now open due to their conscription or enlistment in the armed forces, women stepped in to alleviate the labor shortages that existed in farming, manufacturing, and other war-related industries. But the departure of Ben Hawthorne presented an opportunity for his spouse, but by early 1943, change was in the air. Already popular in his own rights, Bob Steele auditioned to take Travilla's place upon her departure, and he successfully won the chance to become the new host of the popular show. So this was on the morning watch. That was there was some roughness of that particular transition. So that's a very correct observation.
A few different people have mentioned Bob's morning show for children. What about the children's programs every morning at 7:50? Those of us of a certain age remember fondly he would have a children's story every morning?
I will defer to those who have fond recollections of that. The only recollections I have, if I listen to Steele long enough, I recall his recitations of the Albert and the Lion and Albert. I'm sure those people remember that also. And there was some of his old corny songs that he played also that kind of fit that mold. Rolf Harris's Two Buffalo. Some people might remember that also. I'm not sure if that exactly fits the mold of a kid's song, but that was just part of the Bob Steele style. But the Lion and Albert was something that I ran into in the course of researching the book, but I don't have particular recollections of anything devoted specifically to a children's portion of the program, but it would make sense that he would reach out for those instances.
Someone just posted the stories were from phonograph records of the times. Some of them are available on CD.
Okay. And I'm not sure if any of Phil Steele's recordings may have touched on that. Something I should mention as well. I'm just going to page back here if people can still see the screen. The 10 volumes that we see there was also an accompanying series of compact discs that Phil also produced. I purchased one that he has with his conversation with different sporting personalities. He talked to boxers and baseball personalities. I know that among those particular CDs, he may have done something with children's programming. That's only a guess on my part, and I don't want to mislead people, but I know that there were a variety of different topics that were taken from audio tapes, apparently original tapes, and transcribed onto compact discs. So there might be something there also for with regards to children's programming.
And Bob Steele was obviously a wordsmith. He had his word for the day and became enraged when people weren't as grammatically correct as perhaps they should be. Was this like a hobby for him, or was it a pet peeve, or both?
It was actually both. As I mentioned, we saw the way he wanted to pronounce things that finally made it to word for the day. In some cases, if he heard something mispronounced, say like I heard somebody mispronounce something this morning, that particular word would become the word for the day tomorrow because he wanted to provide an immediate correction hearing that. That said, something that's absolutely inescapable, and if you look through these particular 10 volumes of the Bob Steele Century, when you look at Steele's handwritten notes, he just loved the colloquialisms of everyday language. You turn the pages of some of these volumes and he wouldn't write out Saturday, S-A-T-U-R-D-A-Y, the way that we would normally pronounce that. He would see something written phonetically like Saturday, like, almost like a type of an accent. And he just loved that. So there's this conflicting interest of being so exacting with the way words should be spelled and pronounced. But yet in his little colloquial word, he goes 180 degrees, and all these informal things are just littered throughout his diary and his artifacts. And so the contrast is really fun to look at, especially on almost on the same page in some instances.
One of our audience members recalls that the children's story was entitled Long Name No Can Say. He would read a little of the story each day. Okay,
again, I'll defer to their expertise and personal experience with that, so thank you.
And we have someone that has written, what was the name of his longtime theme music? I think the opening tune was A Ride in the Black Forest, and to close his show, it was a Connecticut-themed march.
Yes, I thought of this earlier today, and I completely forgot about it. I did want to open this up, and of course the opportunity is lost now, but the opening of his program, the questioner was almost right. It was a hunt in the Black Forest was the opening theme. You heard the cuckoo and the dog barking and such. And then that was the lead, and that was his opening at 5:30 in the morning. But yes, the song was called A Hunt in the Black Forest. And his closing theme, that wonderful stirring marching music, was the theme of the Connecticut Foot Guard.
Ah, we have another question. Daniel made sure that he didn't leave home without listening to his program. He loved his stories about his many Steele relatives and his respect for the audience. He kept you listening without snarkiness or politics.
Yes. And it is a little bit hard for more modern listeners to understand, but rather than lashing out or poking fun at anybody and everybody else, the biggest target of humor and self-deprecating of deprecating comments was himself. He loved to poke fun at himself because he knew it was always good for a laugh. And this was quite interesting too when I was speaking to Robert Steele, their oldest son, and Phil may have also mentioned this also, that when he was on the air, if he seemed to be poking fun at women, either or both Bob, Robert, or Phil mentioned that when he was doing that, he was really making fun of his wife, Shirley, when he was doing that. So it was sort of a roundabout way to make fun of her. But that was the assurances that they gave me, that and sometimes making fun in that respect did get him in a little bit of trouble on occasion. But he did have to backtrack in the course of some of his shows. But nonetheless, making himself the butt of the joke, that was kind of his stock in trade.
Susan is asking, did any of his sons go into radio?
Phil did for a little bit, yes. Phil, the third son, who, again, he curated all the 10 volumes that we see there. Phil did some radio work for a station in Old Saybrook. The call letters escape me, but he did some work there. But he also worked on his father's program. He did Saturday sports on occasion. It wasn't really a full-time gig, but I remember listening to his show on Saturday mornings on occasion, and Phil Steele would give the sports scores at quarter after and quarter of the hour.
I don't see any other questions. Do you have any questions for us? Like, for instance, how we can purchase your book? I believe we do have it down at the New Haven Museum. Okay.
That said, and Kim, we can take this brief discussion offline or through email. If you have copies of the book, I would be happy to stop by at some point and sign those copies.
Great. If you're interested in getting Paul's book, you can contact us at the New Haven Museum. And I just wanted to thank you, Paul, for such a very interesting and wonderful presentation about a Connecticut icon, Bob Steele.
And thank you so much for your interest and in helping to spread the word. The size of the audience here is very heartening. In similar circumstances, back before all hell broke loose with COVID, the Connecticut Historical Society also hosted me for an event. And that was a live in-person event, but I think we had a room full of people for that too. And it was quite heartening. They did a very interesting job because somewhere in their archives, they actually had some old recordings of his radio show. So as people were walking in, you could hear the man's voice and parts of his program too. And I know we're doing this with Zoom technology, but I greatly appreciate your interest in hosting a very nice event here this evening.
And as I mentioned earlier, Paul, we did have somebody contact us regarding having some personal effects of Bob Steele's. Would you like just to share if anybody would like to give what they may have found, what they should do?
Yes, this has happened on rare occasions, but and I appreciate those people who have offered these things to me personally, but I would prefer that all that material be kept with the artifacts that were donated by the Steele family. I would contact Brenda Miller at the Hartford History Center, which is part of the Hartford Public Library on Main Street in Hartford, Connecticut. And I know Brenda is I believe she's still the director there. But again, Brenda Miller, Hartford History Center, Hartford Public Library in Hartford, Connecticut.
Great.
And
Thank you so
thank you
much.
for anybody who has any inclinations to want to do that, because whether it's newspaper articles or photographs, that sort of thing, there's all kinds of ephemera that they might be interested in. But that would be a great place to keep all that material in one central location. So thank you for anybody that is so inclined.
Thanks again, Paul. And for our audience, I just wanted to ask you to please consider joining us for our next presentation, Voices Waiting to be Heard with Steve Darley, on Thursday, October 14th. You can go to our website and you can join us via the link. So again, thank you so much, Paul. We appreciate all of you who have joined us tonight, and we'll see you next time.
Okay, thank you, Julio, and thank you, Kim.
Good night.
Good night.